on how to avoid common GMAT mistakes. My name is Delise Smith-Barrow, and I'm a reporter with U.S. News and World Report. And hundreds of students take the GMAT every year, hoping to do their best to get into business school. With us, we have three experts who know the test in and out and can help students do their best. We have John Fulmer from the Princeton Review. He's the National Content Director for GMAT programs. We also have Dan Gonzalez, President of Manhattan Prep, a national test preparation organization, and Joanna Graham, Director of Field Marketing for the Graduate Management Admission Council, which administers the GMAT. I'm just going to jump right in and get to the hard questions. Joanna, what would you say is one common mistake that students often make when they are preparing to take the GMAT?
Thanks, Delise. I think the most common mistake that we see is that students underestimate the need to prepare for the exam. And so for many exams in the past, students may have been able to walk into an exam cold without preparing and done just fine. For the GMAT, we really encourage students to prepare ahead of time, to familiarize themselves with the different types of questions that we're asking. The GMAT is also a computer adaptive exam, and so what that means is that students also need to get accustomed to what it feels like to be taking an exam on a computer. There really is a big difference between pencil and paper and computer testing. So I'd say the biggest mistake that we see is that students underestimate how much time they need to prepare and the actual art of preparation.
Art of preparation. And just to kick the question over to you now, Dan, in your experience, what's another mistake that you make?
Yeah, so piggybacking off of what Joanna is saying, the need to approach a computer adaptive test differently from a paper and pencil test. I think this is something that a lot of candidates miss. A lot of people go into the test trying to be perfect. It's kind of like playing checkers. You've got to win every single piece on the board in order to win the game. That's not how the GMAT works. It's actually more like chess, where you've got to strategically sacrifice pieces or sacrifice questions in order to save time and do better perhaps on other questions. So you certainly don't have to get 95, 100% of questions correct on the test. One thing that we teach our students to do is to give themselves 3 or 4 passes when they're taking the test. So 3 or 4 opportunities just to say, you know what, I give up on this one, I'm going to move on to the next one. And that's perfectly fine. You can get a high score by missing a certain percentage of questions.
Great. And Don, not to leave you out, what have you seen that's a big mistake that students make when they are preparing to take the GMAT?
I think that one of the biggest mistakes that students make when they're preparing is they kind of don't get the mix of studying content versus practicing correct. I think that a lot of times it feels like you're really doing something if you're sitting down and you're reading a book and you're refreshing on what an average is or what a median is. And while all of that stuff is very important, it really, on test day, you need to be able to apply that knowledge. And so it's very important that you're constantly doing drills and doing problems from the official guide and taking practice tests.
And kind of going with the notion of practice tests, I've heard that there's a right way to study with practice tests and that there's a wrong way to study with practice tests. Can you all talk about, mistakes that people make when they're using a practice test to study? And anyone can, I guess, just jump in.
Okay, sure. I would say that one of the biggest mistakes that I see that students make is when they take a practice test, they kind of don't look at all of the information that they can get from that practice test. There's, of course, a desire to focus on the big number, what did I get this time? And in many cases, I think that the actual number that comes out from a practice test, where it's a 500, a 600, a 700, is actually sort of the least important number. What you really want to do is you want to use practice tests to try to identify what are the 2 things that really kept me from getting a better score this time, and then work on ways to fix those things. And I always think of it as preparing for the GMAT is sort of a series of trying to always identify what were the things that most kept me from getting a better score this time, going and fixing those things, and then, sort of like going and working on, say, 2 other things. And by the time you're done, if you have fixed half a dozen things, 8 things, now you're really on your way to getting a great score.
Joanna and Dan, anything you want to add to that?
Sure, Delise. I think what I would add to that, I think John made some excellent points. The other piece I would add to that is I think students often fixate on the number and then wonder why that number doesn't match what they see on the actual test day, or if there's a deviation. And one of the things that I like to remind candidates is that when they're taking practice tests, even though they're probably trying to simulate testing conditions as much as possible, test day is going to be a slightly different ballgame. There's obviously going to be the stress and the nerves of test day. And even if you're trying, like I said, to simulate those conditions at home, the fact of the matter is that you know in the back of your mind that it is just that. It's just a practice run. And so, I think that diagnostic scores are they're great milestones and they're great benchmarks to use to guide your prep. I also try to, just encourage students to not put as much stock necessarily in the number itself, but to focus, like John said, on the actual content, the practice, the experience of going through and preparing. Just because there may be some deviation on test day, and a lot of that comes down to just to knowing that something's real versus a practice experience.
Yeah, I think all these are great points. I completely agree. It's less about the score that you get on the practice test and what you do with that experience in the days and weeks afterwards. And I think really learning how to review your work that's a tough skill to acquire. And I think a lot of times people are preparing for the GMAT, review their work, review their practice tests in a pretty superficial way that doesn't allow them to grow in the way that they would if they truly knew how to review the work that they did on the test. So that's a really important piece.
And Dan, can you discuss using, practicing under time conditions when you're using the practice test? I've heard a lot about people kind of not measuring correctly the amount of time they'll need to complete a section or to even study. Can you elaborate on that for me?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what I find with my students is, and this is actually related to a point you made, John, students tend to want to master all of the material before they practice timing. So, 4 or 5 weeks into their preparation, I might ask them, when was the last time you timed yourself when you did a question? And oftentimes the answer is, well, I'm waiting on that part of it until I really relearn all the material. And I think that's a big mistake. I think the first book that you crack, that first question that you do, you should put yourself on the clock and make sure that every time you practice, every time you do a question, that you're timing yourself. Because the GMAT success is certainly about accuracy and getting questions right, but it's about accuracy plus speed. You've got to be able to do the questions quickly. So I would practice timing right from the beginning.
And I know the GMAT is divided into various sections. There's the integrated reasoning section. There's a section that's more quantitative. Is there a certain section of the test that students should focus more on when studying?
I'm sorry, Delise, the question was, is there one section that students tend to focus more on?
Or that they should focus more on when they're studying?
Well, I would say that most students actually probably focus a lot of their attention on the math section. The math seems nice and clear-cut, and there are, sort of like standard rules that you can learn, and that's true. In that sense, math seems comfortable, but it's also the sense that verbal always seems, sort of like, well, I'm just reading through something and picking an answer. In fact, I would actually say that more students actually need to spend more time on their verbal preparation. And, in order to get a really top score on the test, you have to do well on both sections. And I think a lot of people kind of walk in thinking that they're going to kind of like be able to ace the verbal without a lot of difficulty. And yet the verbal section is in many ways as hard as the math section and requires equal preparation.
Please, I would recommend that, I think it's going to be different for every student. Every candidate is going to come to the table with different strengths and weaknesses and different experiences. And especially for some folks, to John's point about the quant section, for some people it may have been several years since they've worked through quantitative problems. So what I usually tell students is that GMAT actually offers 2 free practice exams. It's a software called GMAT Prep. And you don't even have to register for the exam in order to download it. You just need to create a free online account. but it gives you 2 full-length practice exams. And so I usually recommend that students download the software, take a practice exam, and get a rough baseline, because oftentimes they might be surprised by where their strengths and weaknesses actually are. And I think that first baseline report will give them a good roadmap to identify the areas that they probably want to focus on, and but more importantly, need to focus on, because those 2 areas might not always overlap.
Anything you'd like to add, Dan?
I would just say those 2 practice tests, completely agree. Really worth the time and the effort to do those. And those are 2 exams that contain real questions from the test maker. I would recommend doing one at the beginning of your studies to diagnose, as Joanna is saying, and then leaving one for the end of your studies to kind of check your progress.
Is there a certain amount of time that a student should allot for studying in terms of number of weeks or number of months? Anyone can jump in for this one.
I think it's going to vary against the student by student, and it's also going to depend on both personal and professional schedules. Every student is going to be different. Some of them may have day jobs, some of them may already be full-time undergraduate students. I think it's really important, and I like to talk to students about the importance of quality prep versus distracted prep. When we survey candidates and ask them about how much time they spend preparing, the rough data that we have is that students who scored 700 or above spent at least 100 hours preparing for the exam. And that's a really rough data point, because we don't necessarily know if that was over a 2-week window or a 6-month window, or if they were trying to multitask and do multiple things. But I think really the biggest takeaway from that statistic is that it's absolutely imperative that students prepare and carve out some dedicated time to prepare. When I mentioned the distracted prep, I talk with students all the time who talk about how they'll prep on the subway while they're commuting to and from work. They'll prep while they're trying to make dinner at night, and I ask them, it's very much like this idea of distracted driving. You're only really able to focus on one thing really well, even though you think you're multitasking. And so for something as specific and as technical as the GMAT, it's really important that when you are prepping and studying, that you are devoting your full undivided attention to that. And so 5 hours of distracted prep on the subway or while you're cooking dinner might not be as high a quality of prep as 1 hour of solid prep when you're sitting down, you've turned off your cell phone, you've gotten away from social media, and you really are just working through problems and understanding why you're making the mistakes that you're making, and understanding how to wrap your head truly around the content.
One thing I would add to what Joanna is saying, and I think it's a great point, on quality of prep, I think another really important factor is the frequency of your preparation. A lot of times test takers will prepare by studying for 6 hours every Saturday. They've got busy lives between the weekends, full-time jobs, families, etc. So they save all their studying for the weekends. It's just like practicing an instrument, right? If you don't practice it every day, you quickly lose what you've learned. So I would much prefer to see a student sitting down for 45 minutes, 60 minutes of really high-quality, distraction-free prep every single day, instead of spending 6-8 hours on one day over the weekend.
Great. Anything that you'd like to add, John?
No, I would echo both of those points. I see the same thing with students, in the sense that they will often try to do a marathon prep session. What I usually tell students is practice to the point where you are practicing just to get the questions done. And so if you get to that point where all you feel is just like, I just want to get through these 10 more questions and then I can take a break, it's actually time to take the break before you start those 10 questions. Because every question that you do, you always want to be thinking in terms of, well, what do I need to do this question correctly? What should I be looking for? What should I be, what skill am I trying to enhance? And if you're getting to the point where you're just slogging through them to get them done, that's the time to stop. And take a break, and then come back.
Well, speaking of stopping, I think we've actually hit our limit on time. But I wanted to thank you all, Joanna, Dan, John, for giving us all these great tips and all the great advice on how to excel at the GMAT. And for anyone who continues to have questions or you just want to learn more about graduate business school admissions, you can certainly visit usnews.com/education, where we have many articles and other information for you. But thank you again, panelists. hopefully we'll do another one of these soon. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.